I did say that AJR are partnering with us, and Susan Harrod from AJR is with us tonight. So Susan, would you like to say a few words of welcome?
Thank you. Thank you. We're delighted to be partnering with you on this event tonight. I can see lots of AJR members in the audience. For those of you who don't know AJR, we are the largest national Holocaust charity. We work with Holocaust survivors and refugees throughout the UK. And you may like to look at our website, which is www.ajr.org.uk, to learn about our work and make contact with us. Thank you, Ed. Thank you for letting us join with you this evening.
It's a pleasure, and thank you for being with us. And of course, we're going to be joined by our guests in a short while. And just by way of introduction, I want to say a few words. So thank you, Susan, for that. Many of you will have connections with the Holocaust. Thinking for myself, I'm too young to be part of the Holocaust, as old as I feel that I am. And all the various parts of my family left all their original countries at times when those countries were okay for Jews and they weren't suffering oppression. So my family has been very lucky. Lord Sachs, blessed memory, said, history is what happens to other people. Memory is what has happened to us. And in Hebrew, there is no word for history. The closest we get is the Hebrew word for memory. Last week, we celebrated Pesach, the Passover. We recounted the Exodus as if it were we ourselves leaving Egypt, as we are supposed to. We do it in a way that we are recounting something from our own memory, from our own experience. In the post-war years, when I was growing up, the TV on Sunday afternoons, all there was to see was All Our Yesterdays. And that shared the experience of what was found on the liberation of the concentration camps and death camps. And we watched that. There was nothing else to watch. It became part of our routine, part of our lives. And it was recounted again and again and again, for me, as if it was recounting something that was my own. When I visited those places for the first time in 2019, it was as if I was revisiting my memory. I wasn't witnessing history. And so it must be for my generation and for the many generations yet to come, the Holocaust is part of us all, whether we were there in person or not. It is our collective memory. I just want to mention someone for whom I have very fond memories, Sam Laskier. Sam was one of the boys, the Windermere boys. He sat near me in shul. Each Shabbat, we'd have a little chat, and he was full of excitement around the filming, around the story of the boys. And he told me about this guy, Trevor, who was involved with it all. A short time after I came back from Poland, I bumped into Trevor and we got chatting. I was telling him about my experience of visiting the site at Treblinka. And that's when he told me about the work of our guest tonight, Caroline Sturdy-Colls. And so I want to welcome Caroline, and let me just bring you up on Spotlight. Welcome, Caroline. Thank you for joining us, and you're coming to us from Windermere.
I am, yes. I'm currently in Windermere Library because we've been up here doing our second season of field survey this week. It's nice to feel like a real archaeologist again after 2.5 years of COVID and not doing any excavation work. So very grateful for LDHP for hosting us.
So when I went to Treblinka, in fact, went all the sites that I visited in Poland, it was very much like the evidence of, we were lucky to see the evidence of what had happened there, because it had tried to be eradicated. And tell us about how you started becoming involved with the work at Treblinka, and then later on, we'll come to Windermere later on because you're working there as well, which is why you're up there currently. But let's start with Treblinka. how come you came to be doing some archaeology at Treblinka? And I mean, how come they let you?
That's a question I ask myself quite often, and I'm extremely grateful for them for trusting me with such an important site. And I didn't have a personal connection to Treblinka, to the Holocaust myself when I first started doing this work. But I trained as an archaeologist, as a forensic archaeologist, and very early on in my career, I worked with a lot of families who'd lost loved ones and hadn't been able to find where those loved ones were buried. And we call them cold cases in a sort of forensic sense. And seeing the hurt and the torment that caused to those families was something that really motivated me to want to continue to work as a forensic archaeologist, to use archaeological methods to help them find their loved ones. And I'd had a long-standing interest in the Holocaust. I'd worked in a library. I'd met a number of Holocaust survivors during time at school and college. And it had always been something that had really struck me that I couldn't believe that the traces of those crimes hadn't been found. So as part of my master's and then subsequently my PhD, so going back to 2007, I first visited Treblinka, and I was just really struck by the fact that the landscape just does not convey anything of the horrors that happen there. The estimates vary, but between 800,000 and 1 million Jews and others, non-Jewish Poles and a small number of Roma, were killed in that space. But if you went there today, it's beautiful. There's a beautiful landscape. And as an archaeologist, I just couldn't believe that the traces of one of the biggest crimes in history could have been eradicated so easily. So I decided to completely change my topic of interest and try and find a way to develop a methodology that would enable me to examine sites of the Holocaust using some of the same techniques that I'd used as a forensic archaeologist elsewhere. And I wrote to the museum at Treblinka expressing an interest in this after having spoken to the chief rabbi of Poland, Michael Szudryk, about the implications of archaeology and Jewish law. And I filled in lots of forms, wrote lots of letters, took a Polish course, and somehow in the midst of all that, I got the permission to do the work. And I think a lot of that was down to the fact that I wanted to try and develop the methodology that I was using to make sure that it did meet the needs of Jewish law with regards to not disturbing Jewish burials at Treblinka and mapping them in different ways.
Do you think other people had been doing work which was not respectful of Jewish tradition?
There'd been a lot of projects that had suddenly emerged in the 80s and 90s in particular, done by archaeologists, really. Some excavations as well going back to the 60s, but really sort of in the 1980s and 90s. And there was a big controversy around the Belzec death camp, where archaeologists had started to work there in the 1990s when the landscape was going to be redeveloped for a memorial. And the archaeologists there had claimed that they wanted to find out what had happened at the site so that they could avoid the areas containing human remains when the memorial was built. But unfortunately, the methods that they choose to do this actually disturbed the remains through not so much excavation, but they used a method called coring, which basically, as it sounds, is a giant metal rod that is probed into the ground, and then soil samples are removed. So obviously, in the course of doing that, they obviously remove samples of human remains and graves on the site. And there was a huge outcry from the Jewish community. There was a lawsuit that was started by one of the Holocaust survivors against the people who'd organized this, and it became very, very controversial. So reading those reports, those kind of methods, I just saw that didn't fit with the way that archaeologists should be conducting themselves, when the idea was to commemorate the victims, to honor the victims. And so I felt really strongly that the methodology had to be adapted to make sure that it was respectful. It could still be scientific and historical at the same time, but it had to be respectful for the people whose memory we were trying to honor.
So the site at Treblinka, many people know that the Nazis tried repeatedly to obliterate any evidence that was there. But so what did you find when you got there? And for anybody who's not actually visited it, can you just briefly describe what it looks like now, and perhaps say what were the challenges? Because in the first place, I mean, many of the sites that I visited had been organized in the way that we see them today, and certainly the memorials and statues and monuments, rather, I should say, were created by the Soviets. And that's very much a style that's there. So did they already think that they'd found everything that was going to be found through people's recounting what they knew of the camps, or was there a lot of gaps? And just what did it look like to an ordinary visitor?
Sure, and I'll share my screen actually, so that you can see a photograph of the monument at Treblinka now. So this is how the site looks today. I'll just make that full screen. So this is part of the memorial that exists there today. So there's the central memorial obelisk that you can see there, and a stone next to it that says "Never Again." And then the granite blocks that you can see around the central memorial. There's 17,000 of those stones that have been placed into concrete bases at various points around the former death camp area. And many of them bear the names of cities and towns and villages from which the people were sent to Treblinka. So it's an incredibly powerful monument, and you walk towards it from the railway platform, the symbolic railway platform that you can see in the foreground there. Because the railway spur line had been removed as well since the war and when this memorial was built. So this was built in the 1960s. Obviously, at that time, Poland was occupied and part of the Soviet Union. So there were various initiatives, as you've suggested, around the memorial design. And this was the one that was ultimately chosen. And what, as I said, it's very, very powerful, but what it's done is it's obviously obscured part of the landscape. And the other idea was to plant a lot of trees around at that time as well. A lot of people who go to Treblinka today think that most of this forest was there at the time, and some of it was, and that was part of the reason why the Nazis chose the site, because it was quite well concealed by the pine forest. But a lot of these trees were planted later in the words of the architects and memorial site, to protect the landscape. So obviously, as an archaeologist, one of the challenges is that a good part of this landscape is actually inaccessible because of the memorial and the landscape itself. So one of the first things when I first got to the site was to essentially just to walk around and take a look, because first impressions, there's nothing here. But actually, as soon as we started to walk in the forested areas and even in the open grassland between the memorial, we started to see changes in vegetation. We started to see subtle depressions in the ground, and we started to see different kind of traces that we thought maybe indicating that buried remains could be present. And we also came across objects. In the first field season that we did, we came across a large number of objects on the surface, which had been dug up subsequently, obviously, in subsequent years. So we knew we needed to protect them. And I think one of the things about Treblinka is there is this narrative that's been built up that the Nazis were successful in destroying all the traces of their crimes, because the camp was gradually closed down after the revolt in August 1943. So by the time the Red Army arrived in August 1944, obviously quite a long time had elapsed. The Nazis had had time to level the site and to plant over it and to try and hide the traces. And so that narrative that they came up with actually was then kind of perpetuated over the years, and perpetuated by post-war investigators as well, who kind of went there and went, well, this doesn't look like Auschwitz. It doesn't look like Majdanek. There aren't surviving buildings, so there's nothing here. But actually, when you go back to their primary records, you find that they actually found an awful lot of evidence. And so I use their records a lot retrospectively with a kind of forensic archaeological eye to reconstruct some of the evidence that has been destroyed. And then obviously more modern methods to map what exists beneath the ground. And that narrative sort of protected the remains in a way, because nobody else went there to investigate after 1947. So aside from the memorial redevelopment, there haven't actually been any official other excavations on the site since then.
And were there things which people had said, oh, this definitely was the way the camp was, which then you discovered was actually not the case?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, in a lot of testimony after the war, kind of post-war historical texts, Claude Lanzmann, for example, in Shoah, claimed that the gas chambers were under the memorial obelisk that you can see in the center of the image. So everybody thought that people walked from the railway platform as it exists now along the gravel and cobble path that you can see in the image, and that they then reached the gas chambers in quite a short distance. So one of the things that I actually had to do was kind of go back and look for things like aerial photographs and look at traces in the landscape that may indicate where the fences were. And so I started to kind of map all of these landscape change, depressions, things like that, and then where the railway platform would have been. And then it became apparent to us that actually the current memorial site, the area that was marked, was too small. And the actual granite boulders around the edges were actually in the wrong place. And so essentially, I'll come back to these methods in a minute, but we managed to create this kind of new map which demonstrated where the boundaries of the camp would have been. And when we looked at the fact that the symbolic memorial for the railway, for example, was like half the size that the actual railway platform was, and that the memorial markers were in the wrong place for the northern fence in particular, we could kind of readjust our perspective of where everything else should be. And then it became very apparent that the memorial obelisk simply couldn't have been where the gas chambers were located, because there wouldn't have been room for all the reception camp buildings that existed there, and all the room even for bringing that many people off the trains. So that kind of discovery of that initial sort of spatial understanding of the site enabled us then to kind of target other areas across the camp as well for further investigation.
So this image, map that we're seeing now, this is the revised placement, is it?
Yeah, this is kind of a sketch. It's quite old now, but it's kind of a sketch of the first season of fieldwork that we did, where we were using various methods, technologies that enabled us to scan beneath the ground, and mapping technologies, as I say, to map kind of vegetation change and other traces that we could see on the surface. And this sort of enabled us to think that, as I said, that the death camp, as it was called, the area containing the gas chambers and the mass graves, existed further into the camp landscape. And so the blue dots that you can see here are clusters of mass graves that we were able to identify with those ground scanning, we call them geophysical technologies. They enabled us to look at the physical properties in the soil, look for what we call anomalies, differences, things that have interrupted the natural geology of the site, and to look at them and measure them and examine their placement. And so we did that, and that became apparent that they were consistent with large pits in two very distinct areas within the death camp, and then that we had this kind of cluster of buildings in the reception camp area, and then the possible locations of the gas chambers. So this is kind of based on that initial field work that we did, which was entirely non-invasive at that stage.
So you're talking about non-invasive there. Would you like to describe, just so that people get an idea of the technical things that you were doing?
Yeah, absolutely.
What was the equipment? I mean, we've seen the theodolites that you've got in the photograph, so mapping out areas, and people will know that from seeing surveyors on the street. But what are the techniques that you had to use that we wouldn't normally see?
So I think you're quite rightly pointed out there. Yeah, we've got a total station theodolite that we use to measure distance, and you can plot out features that you can see on the surface. So we could map where the objects were, if there was concrete visible, for example, or bricks, or any depressions, vegetation change. We could use those to create a map of those on the site. The top left corner, what you can see there is a GPS system. So same as a GPS you've got in your phone and your car, but it's accurate to millimeter level. So again, you can do a couple of things with it. One is that you can plot the position of features like you can with the total station. The other is that you basically can walk up and down in very closely packed lines, collecting points, so GPS points as you go, which are accurate to millimeter level. And when you put all those together, you can basically create a digital terrain model, so a 3D model of what the surface of the landscape looks like. So again, these methods help us because the 3D model that they generate often shows subtle depressions that you can't see with the naked eye. And when things are buried under the ground, as the ground settles over them, of course, the ground sinks. And so often when you've got buried buildings, when you've got graves, and you've got other features, it's possible to detect them with this kind of micro level technology. So it's quite fantastic in that sense. And then the other methods you can see a couple of them on the screen here. These are these geophysical methods that I mentioned. So on the left, you've got a ground penetrating radar, and on the right, you've got a resistance survey. And these are two methods that emit different types of pulses into the ground. So radar, it's electromagnetic pulses, and resistance survey is electrical resistance. So when these pulses encounter different materials in the soil, they'll be basically reflected back to the machine differently. And we can measure then the time it takes that to happen, or the resistance to that. And that tells us something about what is buried beneath the ground. So it's not like an X-ray. You know, they're quite highly specialized techniques that require quite detailed interpretation. They don't show you exactly what exists beneath the ground, but they will show you changes, they will show you shapes that you can then overlay that data onto aerial photographs, and other maps and plans drawn by witnesses, for example, to get a sense of what those traces might be. So these were some of the early methods we used, and of course, as technology is developing, we're using things like drones and you know, other technologies to create more detailed 3D models from the air as well, to detect some of those subtle changes that I mentioned.
So building all those technologies together, does that come to be something like an image of what's under the surface?
Yeah, so what you will ultimately get, if I'll just switch to one of these other slides. So if we look on the one on the right hand side here, this is a technique called LiDAR. So this is basically it's a laser scanner that's mounted from a plane, and it sends out thousands and thousands of pulses every second, and they're reflected back from the ground, and again, it measures the different heights of the ground surface in different places to, you know, very minute levels of accuracy. So what you're seeing here is a kind of bare earth image of the landscape at Treblinka. So you've got the memorial obelisk in the middle here, and then you can basically see here that all the trees that should have been in this northern part of the camp have been stripped away digitally. So this technology is wonderful because it distinguishes between the ground and vegetation. So it's one way that we can actually map what was at Treblinka without actually needing to cut down any vegetation or use any other techniques in difficult forested areas. This really shows us what the camp looked like before all those trees were planted. So this has been an absolutely phenomenal technology for this particular site because so many trees were present. And you can just see in the box there that this is one of the depressions that we found that's been absolutely central to the work that we've done. So this was a depression. We could see it with the naked eye a little bit, but the LiDAR basically shows that depression quite well. And it does look strange in a relatively flat area. So this was one area that we decided to target with the geophysical technologies, and then ultimately a bit later with some excavation as well.
And having got this picture, what does it tell us about the story of Treblinka? Maybe that's different from what we've understood previously. I mean, you've indicated already, you know, saying that people were giving the story that the obelisk is where the gas chambers were, but it wasn't. But in terms of what was the story about what was being done and the deceptions that were involved in it?
So when people, deception was a central part of what was happening at Treblinka, and so I'll explain a little bit about that first, and then I'll tell you obviously what the kind of key discoveries were. So when people arrived at Treblinka, they arrived in around about 60 cattle wagons, and they were moved into the area. This is a railway siding that came off a main railway line. So the railway line, you can see that it's marked on this particular plan as a symbolic railway platform is there, but actually the railway siding kind of extended all the way down this western side of the camp. And when people exited the trains, they came into what was designed as a mock railway station area. There were signs pointing to Warsaw, to Białystok. There was a fake ticket office. People were told to give over their belongings, and they'd receive a tag, and then they'd get them back when they'd been to have a shower. And there was even a fake hospital that was situated at the site as well, where people were told that they would face medical treatment. But actually, in reality, behind that building, there was a giant mass grave, essentially, that was usually on fire. And elderly people and children would be taken there rather than being taken to the gas chambers. And this building, this frontage, was designed to trick people, into believing that they were actually going to get medical help. And it was obviously a complete lie, as were the other buildings. And so once people then, if people didn't go to the lazaret and they went to the gas chambers, the usual route that they would take would be to walk along the Himmelstrasse, which was called the road to heaven by the Germans. And that led to the gas chamber building. So obviously to go from the undressing barracks, from the reception camp area, the railway platform, the undressing barracks, along that road into the gas chambers, that's why we didn't think that the memorial obelisk could have been where the gas chambers were, because there wasn't actually that space for that many people. And I should point out that for most people who arrived at Treblinka, that whole process of being sent to the gas chambers lasted around 15 minutes for men and about 20 minutes for women, because they had to have their hair cut. So, this whole area, this is a very small area, really, considering how many people, unfortunately, 10 to 12,000 people a day sometimes were passing through this area. So what this image showed us, this depression that we started to investigate in more detail, when we looked at this geophysically, so with those ground scanning methods that I mentioned, we came across, as you can see in the bottom left-hand screen here, an area, almost rectangular feature that measured about 22 meters by 15 meters. And it was consistent with structural remains. And we know that the gas chambers were the only buildings built of brick in the death camp area. So as soon as we found this, we were thinking, well, could this be the original, what was known as the old gas chamber building? So the LiDAR data on the right-hand side led us to further analysis. The ground penetrating radar that led us to more detail with regards to the shape and plan of this apparent structure. And then I basically asked permission from the chief rabbi of Poland if we could excavate in this area, because we knew where the mass graves were because of some of the other non-invasive work that we'd done, and we knew we could avoid those areas. So in agreement with him, then obviously I applied for permission, and in 2013 we carried out an excavation. And that then subsequently led to us discovering the foundations of the gas chamber building, and further investigation in 2007 as well about that particular structure.
So 2007 was when you began your work at Treblinka, is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And in what years was the main work done? And I know you're still going back. Yes,
I've been, obviously COVID sort of stopped me from going, as I said, anywhere really, but I'm still working on the site and on the research as well. So 2010 was when I first did the first investigations, which were all non-invasive. And then in 2013, that's when we did the first excavations in the old gas chamber area. And then subsequently 2017, 2019, some of the other works.
Can I go back to these deceptions that you were talking about and the way that people were treated, I guess? There was one particular find, one of the ceramic tiles. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, I can. Yeah, well, I will share my screen again just to give you a bit more of a visual of that as well. So when we started to do the excavation, one of the things that really struck us was that we found, obviously from the geophysics, we knew roughly how deep the foundations of the building were going to be. And we knew this was confirmed by the excavation. So they were actually around about 85 centimeters beneath the ground. So one of the things that this told us was part of the reason why they'd never been found before. And that was because the Nazis had basically covered the area with large amounts of sand. There were sandbanks. I can show you in a minute, there's a picture, but there were sandbanks around the area of the gas chambers. And we think that they basically pushed them over when they leveled the site. So this is why a lot of the post-war investigators, when they were searching for the remains, they didn't find them because they didn't actually dig deep enough. But ironically, actually, when we started to dig, we came across building fragments, like brick and tile fragments very, very quickly, but just not in situ. As I say, the foundations were much deeper. So I'll just show you that these were some of the bricks and things that we were finding, and some of the pieces of plaster that would have been on the walls, for example, some of the roof tiles. But these were the tiles that we found many of at the site. And of course, one of the things that strikes you when you first look at them and you think you see the star, and you know, I have to admit, at first when I saw them, I thought, what is this? You know, is this a Star of David on the tiles? Why am I looking at this in Treblinka? Like, what does this actually mean? Actually, though, quite quickly we did some research about them, and actually this is not a connection. It isn't a Star of David. It's actually a logo of a Polish tile manufacturing company called Geophysical and Lange. And you can see maybe just the D and the L on the either side of the star. And this just happened to be their logo. But what's really interesting about these tiles, there's a few things. So one is that witnesses talk about the fact that the gas chambers were modelled on a bathhouse to give the illusion that people were going for a shower and then they would be sent to the east to work. And so the use of these tiles obviously demonstrated that the gas chambers really was, as testimonies had suggested, you know, they'd gone to great lengths to make this look like a bathhouse. And witnesses, many witnesses, there weren't many, of course, who saw the gas chambers and lived to tell their experiences. But those that did described terracotta tiles, clay tiles, some yellow, some orange. So these match perfectly with what witnesses were saying. But what's really interesting about these, I'm still researching this many years. I'm still trying to find out exactly how these tiles got to Treblinka, whether they were purposefully manufactured by Geophysical and Lange and sent from new as a shipment to the site, or whether they were actually taken from somewhere else, because the only other places that I've actually found these exact same tiles are in a number of Jewish mikveh, a number of Jewish ritual baths around the Warsaw and Lublin area. And these exactly the same colour, exactly the same style, all made by Geophysical and Lange, all with the star logo on the bottom. And so I don't, you know, obviously that would be the ultimate deception if they took the tiles from Jewish ritual baths and took them to Treblinka and tried to make the gas chambers look in that way. And so at the moment I can't prove that, you know, through historical documents, but obviously that's what we found in terms of comparative examples for these tiles.
That's absolutely astonishing. I can't believe that, because that sounds like it involves a lot of work. You've got to reclaim those tiles, and you know that I mean the Nazis had a huge war machine, and they were you know, using everything, including the people who went to the, you know, the body parts of the people who went to the gas chambers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, it's not without the realms of possibility that that's what they did at all, because we know a lot of the Jewish ritual baths, of course, in the Warsaw Ghetto were destroyed, and part of the cultural genocide of the Jewish population was to also make them do exactly this kind of work. They did the same thing in Jewish cemeteries by making people destroy tombstones so that they could be used for road and construction projects. And so, you know, you can imagine that they could have used Jewish labourers to remove these tiles from somewhere to bring them to Treblinka. But as I say, I mean, I can't 100% say that. And I do have some documents about materials that the camp commandant asked for and asked to be requisitioned from other places, but I've not yet, you know, found the letter that mentions the tiles. But I guess I'll keep looking for that.
Yes, I mean, I imagine the people in the audience tonight will have family members who were lost in the Holocaust, and will have their own feelings about what went on there. And as I said, I think it's, you know, it's so important that it becomes part of our DNA, that we can tell the story when all those people are gone, when that generation, who are sadly very small now, in numbers, and their subsequent generations, we need to be able to tell that story in the same way that we tell the Passover story, and understanding that through understanding the work that you're doing. It might be difficult to hear and difficult to think about, and I have to say I'm feeling quite challenged. It is, you know, one of those things that I think we do need to know, however difficult it is. So how far along the route of understanding Treblinka do you think you are?
Well, I think after all this time, I often like to think that I've got a really good understanding, and then I keep finding new materials. So this is why I'm working on a book about Treblinka, which I've been working on for a long time. And I keep saying it's going to be finished soon, and then I found more materials. So I guess that's the burden that every historian and archaeologist, has always got to bear. But I think it's so important, as you said, to tell the story to the fullest ability, because, a handful of people you talk to maybe know the name Treblinka, but most, if people even know the name Auschwitz now, obviously that's becoming increasingly less common. And so I think it's so important to tell the story of this site, because obviously with the other operation, Reinhard camps, Belgius and Sobibor in particular, it embodied the final solution. That's what these camps were designed for. They were there was a reason that they didn't have a large number of accommodation buildings for members of the Jewish community or anybody else. It was because, obviously, as I said before, people were it was designed to kill them when they first arrived. So I think and because of that, there were few witnesses after the war to the stories, and we do have some amazing testimonies. But of course, we also have lots of questions that weren't asked, which I, as an archaeologist, would and often do. If I have the honor of meeting Holocaust survivors, I will ask slightly different questions about the layout of the camp and try and understand it. So I think understanding the architecture of the camp and the mechanisms, obviously, of the killing that was going on there helps us understand the experiences of the victims who at a site like Treblinka simply can't speak for themselves, because there's so many people were murdered in such a way. But one of the things that I'm increasingly finding is that new documents emerge from those post-war investigations. So particularly Soviet documents are absolutely proving invaluable. Working at the moment with a number of testimonies of the Treblinka men. So these were guards who were often Ukrainian or Latvian or Lithuanian, who worked in the camp, and their records have sat in archives in the Soviet Union and Russia, for many years, never been found. And so that's adding new perspectives on the camps as well, and the interviews that they did with witnesses who were there in July and August 1944 are remarkable, because they were often very different than the ones that were given in 1945, suggesting that actually there were more traces of the camp that did survive in the immediate aftermath of the camp being abandoned. And in fact, many of those traces were subsequently removed over the course of the next year, not by the Germans, but actually, presumably by what we know, Treblinka, obviously looting was very prevalent in that area at the time. So I think going back to images, going back to documents, it's leading to new understandings of the site, and also of the fact that it wasn't just an extermination camp, but that there was a labour camp, an execution site, and other elements, work sites, for example, that made up Treblinka's landscape. So that's really what I'm trying to do, is kind of push the understanding beyond those historical narratives that suggest that it's been destroyed into a much richer one that tries to understand the whole camp's history and its afterlife as well.
Yes, well, Treblinka, like I think Majdanek as well, had another labour camp, which was for Poles and other people, not non-Jews, which were very much hard labour camps. But the Treblinka, tell us about the labour camp there, because that's one of the ways that you found out some of these people who were able to recount what had happened and who had survived because they weren't in the death camp.
Yeah, so this is one of the big parts of my project that I think has really brought the history of Treblinka further along than previously, in that everybody, of course, talks about the extermination camp, and it's extremely important that we do. But in doing so, the labour camp that existed there has been overshadowed. But that camp was fundamental to the way that the extermination camp actually worked and operated. And so, in fact, the labour camp was built in 1941. And originally it was sort of run by a local regional governor, and then the SS came and took over. And that camp, basically, it was called a labour camp, but it operated much more like a concentration camp with death camp elements to it. And a lot of my work has shown the brutality, the face-to-face brutality that was levied against those prisoners by the guards. And the success of those killing methods, I hate to use that word, but to them, you know, the success of the killing methods in that camp, where they were executing people in a whole host of terrible ways, meant that that was part of the reason why they built the extermination camp, because they'd got away with it in the Labour camp, because everybody thought it was an innocent place. So people, when they heard they were being sent to Treblinka, just assumed they were going to another Labour camp there. And so what you then had, of course, was prisoners in the Labour camp who saw, who smelled, who, you know, were often walking past the extermination camp. And for those few who did survive, they went on to give their testimony about that, and also about their own experiences in the Labour camp as well. So that's been really fundamental. But crucially, the work has showed that, contrary to popular opinion, that wasn't a Labour camp exclusively for non-Jewish Poles. There was a large demographic of Jewish inmates. Most of them were specialist workers. So that was known. But again, that kind of idea that they were specialist workers, they were treated better, was part of the narrative that was presented about the site. But I found lots of evidence of summary executions of Jewish people, of sexual violence against them, with murder to follow, with people being blackmailed by the presence of their families in the camp. And the ill treatment there was terrible, and they were still mistreating Jews in that camp on a face-to-face basis, even when the extermination camp was operating. And in fact, the execution site south of the Labour camp had been used since 1942 as a place where Jews from Warsaw who were in the prisons were sent, because they were given the death penalty by Warsaw's courts. And so it became an official mandate to send them to Treblinka execution site and kill them there by shooting and burial in mass graves. So this is completely independent of the extermination camp. It predates it, it was concurrent to it, and it carried on afterwards until July 1944.
So it's quite phenomenal. I think I've got to ask you, has there been any resistance to your work there?
I think in some ways, yes and no. I mean, I think, as you said before, like, I'm still kind of very surprised that I was ever able to go and work there, as you know, given that I was kind of going in as somebody not from Poland, somebody, you know, with no connection to the Holocaust, as many other archaeologists who've worked in this field have. So I've always felt very welcomed by the museum and by the chief rabbi in particular, who's always been very, very helpful. I think there's been two kind of elements of the work where resistance have come in different forms. So one is, I think, in kind of recent years, obviously political changes have happened in Poland. There have been museum takeovers, changes to infrastructure, that kind of thing. So I don't know whether, in some ways, resistance is the wrong word, but I think there's much more of a desire for Polish archaeologists to be involved in the work, for the Polish ministries to tell the story of Treblinka. And in some ways that's been very good, because it's been more investment into the site and more development. But obviously sometimes that has meant that the stories, for example, of the Jews at the Labour camp, that story is not still told, to the extent that I just described. So I think that there's still these attempts to shift the narrative onto certain aspects, which, of course, if the archaeological work doesn't fit that, then sometimes we'll encounter resistance in those areas. And then sometimes I think some people are still uncomfortable with the idea of archaeology being done at Treblinka at all. And I think there's been some people who've heard the word archaeology and assumed excavation, and haven't looked into kind of the background of the work that I do, and the fact that the non-invasive work is fundamental to my methodology, that Jewish law is fundamental to my methodology. So, occasionally there's been some sort of resistance, in the sense of people saying, well, you've been excavating at the death camps, you shouldn't be doing that. But as I mentioned, everything has been signed off by the chief rabbi. My whole methodology is centered around Jewish law. So it's just a case of kind of speaking and engaging with those people and trying to explain that obviously that isn't what has happened here. And in fact, I was inspired, as I said before, not to conduct myself in that way because of the fact that archaeologists had done so in the past.
I think we could talk about Treblinka for a very, very long time. You could, I mean, the amount of work you've done, obviously you can, but you know, having visited it and then starting to understand it afresh from the work you've done, I've got so many questions. I'm sure the audience do, but we need to talk about other things as well. But so at this point, I'd just like to say that a couple of people have put questions in the chat. If you've got a question, please do put it in the chat. We can see it. You might not be able to, you can't chat backwards and forwards because it's just the people running the Zoom who can read the chat today, but we will read your questions. So please put them in there as you think of them. And if we've got, for those that we can, we'll read them out at a short point. As we've just got a couple, maybe I'll turn to those now. And after that, we'll start to talk about the work at Windermere and how that all fits in with this. So I've got one, which is from Cindy in the US, and she says, amazing presentation. I'm just wondering whether you, Caroline, are familiar with the work of Richard Friend at Christopher Newport University, who's employed a number of techniques, penetrating radar and things like that, and has worked at Sobibor and this escape tunnels, I can't pronounce this, in Lithuania.
Yeah.
So I won't embarrass people by trying to say it wrong. But so has your work, first of all, you know, were you the only person working in this area? Were there other people working in this area? And has it stimulated work like this, or have you been stimulated by people like has just been mentioned in the question?
Yeah, so yeah, I'm familiar with Richard's work. I've met Richard before, and you know, in many ways we do very similar work. And actually, the project at Sobibor that he was involved in, along with it's led by Yoram Hamy, an Israeli archaeologist, and Wojciech Mazurek, a Polish archaeologist, for many years. But they actually started their work in 2007, same time as me. So it must have been a year for this sort of, you know, work to happen. And that sort of, as I said, followed on from, you know, kind of interest in the 1980s of museum curators and others and archaeologists kind of getting involved in this area. But I think what probably sets my work and also Richard's and Yoram's apart from some of that earlier work is that much of that earlier work was motivated by the desire to build new museums and memorials at those sites, rather than specifically a humanitarian and archaeological research framework. So like I said, that's kind of how a lot of those earlier archaeologists sort of got themselves into quite a lot of trouble in those areas, and of course memorials are always controversial as well, so the two combined led to quite a lot of controversy. So yeah, so Richard's actually, he's asked me a number of times to go on projects with him, and for various reasons, babies mainly, I haven't actually been able to join him on field work, but hopefully one day we'll also, you know, we'll collaborate, because we do share, you know, many of the same techniques, and his work has really been amazing as well at finding out new information at sites. And again, he's respectful of Jewish law by using the non-invasive methodologies. And I think, you know, as I said, so I can't claim to be the only person doing this historically, but I think when I started my work, obviously I really did promote the non-invasive angle of what I do, and the need to respect Jewish law and the kind of archaeological ethics surrounding what we do. And so in 2015, I wrote a book called Holocaust Archaeologies, where I tried to kind of articulate my experiences of working at Treblinka, but also at a number of other sites from my PhD, and then afterwards, so in Serbia and Germany and the UK Channel Islands. And so I think once that was published and lots of students and you know, other archaeologists saw that, I know like a lot of them write to me and have said that that's kind of shaped new methodologies and it's inspired new projects. And hopefully it's, you know, one of the biggest things I hope it's inspired, it's a kind of a more ethical practice of archaeology moving forward.
And do you think it's inspired more forensic archaeology within Poland itself, either by the Poles or by others, which are discovering things which haven't been even thought of before?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's why, so when you asked me that question about resistance, I sort of see some of it as being kind of resistance, but then some of it I think is just because forensic archaeology as a discipline has really grown in Poland. And actually now there are a lot of very good and very talented forensic archaeologists that have begun to work in this field. And, and I kind of look at them, obviously I read their work and things, so I can kind of see in the footnotes that sometimes they say that the work at Treblinka inspired that. And that's really, it's fabulous to see that. And so there've been a much larger number of projects being undertaken. The one recently that's kind of made the press quite often is the work in Death Valley that's been undertaken by David Kobiałka and other Polish archaeologists in his team. So it's a new discipline that's been born there really in the last decade, which is really great to see, because it's not a universal subject that exists in every country in the world.
Apologies for anybody who's putting questions in. There's quite a few coming. I'm not sure that we're going to have time to answer everybody. We might come back to them at the end. We've given ourselves, by the way, between 9:15 and 9:30 to run the event too. So please do stay with us, because we've still got a lot to find out about. But I'll just pick maybe one more or two more. From Gina. She says, when I visited in 2009 to honour a great aunt and uncle who were murdered at Treblinka, there were the roasts, she puts in quotes, on the site where the bodies were burnt. Were these in the right place or not?
So these were, again, they were symbolic. So I think there was some sense of when they were put there that they represented the general area. So we did have some areas in our geophysics that we felt could have been one of them, because we know that there were two. Obviously, we couldn't test above the one that's there at the moment because of the fact that it's a symbolic, it's a memorial. We didn't want to run the equipment over that, and actually, it's sort of the material that it's made from made it physically impossible. So they were the one that is there is kind of in the rough ballpark area of that death camp area where the gas chambers would have been. And that's a really important thing to remember as well, that all of this, I appreciate, and I'm so sorry that I always feel like I have to tell people these terrible details, but I think it's important to say that what the Nazis did at Treblinka in terms of killing this many people, at first they used mass graves and then they used cremation pyres. They never had a crematorium there. So one of the kind of myths that has grown up around the site is that everybody who was killed there was cremated, and that was again one of the reasons why people thought there was nothing to be found at Treblinka. But actually, again, our research has shown that that's not the case. That as I said, originally graves were used, and even their efforts to hide the bodies weren't always comprehensive. But in some ways, the site was incredibly primitive. But obviously, as I said before, the numbers of people killed there was staggering. So it doesn't bear thinking about what would have happened there if they would have introduced some of the infrastructure that you see at other camps like Auschwitz and Majdanek.
So there's a number of detailed questions coming up, but if other ways that people can find out more about the work you've been done there outside of this call.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I've published quite a lot of articles about this, some academic, some deliberately not, on purpose. So, I mean, there's quite a lot of materials out there. For example, like online magazines like Sapiens and Live Science. They both did sort of popular pieces about the work that we did, and explain that in a non-tabloid but not too scientific way. So I think they're quite accessible if you wanted to, for people who want to share them with friends and family and students and things. I think they're a kind of good starting point. As I mentioned, I also I've written my book Holocaust Archaeologies, which details a lot of the work I've done at Treblinka, and I think I've got let me just check I think I might have a slide here with our web link on rather than me read it out, but yeah, you can just maybe if I share the screen again, you can see that on our website I've got like a list of obviously all my publications and other websites and things that explain some of the work that we do. So I'll just pop that up there. It's just stats.ac.uk/archaeology, and then there are various other books there that you can see that they include some of the work that I've been doing more recently as well. Right,
I'll just So we'll send that out. We're going to send out an email after this with the link to the video, the recording of this. So Caroline, if you send me that, I will copy it into that email.
Great, I can do that. No problem.
That way. That's fantastic.
Yeah. And I should also say, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that we did also make a TV documentary about the work in Treblinka in 2013. So there's 2 versions of it. One of them is called Treblinka, Hitler's Killing Machine, and the other one is Inside Hitler's Secret Death Camp. So again, I can send the titles, but they're essentially the same program, but one was shown in the UK and one was in the US on Smithsonian, and they were just they had a slightly different title, but that shows some of the work.
And are those available online to view?
Yes, I think so. I mean, obviously, it depends on the sort of streaming services and what country you're in. But generally speaking, I think, and if not, I shouldn't say this, but if not legally, then it tends to pop up on YouTube every now and again before it gets taken down. So I'm sure you could find it somewhere.
Yes, and the visit that I made in 2019, there's a section within the little film that I did from that, which is on our YouTube channel, and in there Jeremy Kernitz, whose family was lost at Treblinka and who was our guide, recounts some of the documentation about the circumstances of Treblinka, which is quite heartrending and moving, I have to say. So if you want to find that, go to YouTube and look for Jewish Small Communities Network, which is also where you'll be finding this recording. So let's move on now, and maybe we'll switch over to Trevor. If Trevor wants to come in, I shall make him spotlighted. Yeah, there we go. Trevor Avery created and runs the Lake District Holocaust Project up in Windermere. Good evening, Trevor.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone.
And like I said at the beginning, it was you who told me about Caroline's work in the first place. But Sam Laskier was just enabling the subtitles to come on there. Had been in many of the concentration camps and had experienced the ardours of what the Nazis applied, and came as one of the boys to Windermere. There was a number of sites around the country, and Windermere was one of them, where children who were just refugees at the end of the war came over to this country. So how did, Trevor, just tell us how that started as a project for you, and how that then started to, how you brought in Caroline, and why you brought in Caroline to Windermere.
Isn't she remarkable? You know, the team, I've been very lucky to work up close to them. So it's a bit of a struggle for me to sort of follow that. But the project began in 2005 in Windermere, and there are sort of parallels to the landscape at Treblinka and to Windermere, which sound extraordinary, but they're essentially non-sites. If you don't know what went on there when you first approach them, you wonder what was here at Calgarth or at Treblinka. And it was simply because a gentleman, was chatting to a gentleman in Kendal, and he said, of course, you know, here in Calgarth, which was a wartime housing scheme to house workers for the local aircraft factory, Short Sunderland factory, this is where the children from Auschwitz came. And of course, I didn't know that. I was utterly taken aback. To cut a very, very long story short, the first of the boys, or we call them the Windermere children now, that I spoke to was Sir Ben Helfgott. And I rang Ben and simply said, I hear you were one of the youngsters that came to the Lake District to Windermere in 1945. And he said, I was. He said, oh, Windermere, which was quite a response. And I said, well, I'd like to look to do a project with you about you guys and establish a memorial in the Lake District. And he said, no, Trevor, no memorials. We didn't die there. We came alive again. So that's been our sort of USP in a sense. We were given a license by Ben and the guys to do a slightly different approach to celebrate their survival. But all the way through this, I was very taken by the fact that they said, described in Martin Gilbert's book from the 90s, they came from hell to paradise. But when I met them, incredibly welcoming elder statesmen in a sense, I was very aware that what was this hell they came from. I had some knowledge of it, but I hadn't visited, I hadn't been. So I thought, well, I'm going to go and visit and see where they came from, which perplexed them, I have to say. Why do you want to go back there? Why do you want to see? There's nothing to see. I said, I'm just curious for my own journey, so I could get to grips with what these children in Windermere, what were they doing here? Where did they come from? And I visited Auschwitz, and then I began to visit some of the shtetls and the little towns and villages that nobody who doesn't have an intense interest in this would probably think of in Britain. You know, Piotrków, Shiraz, and then there were Lodz ghettos, Łódź, Warsaw. But Sam was pretty key in this. I began to talk to the guys. There were many of them that I spoke to, but Sam last year wouldn't talk about the past. He said, I'll talk about Windermere, but not what went on before. So we never did. We became incredibly close friends. He would let the odd nugget of information in, but he even had his 90th birthday celebration in the exhibition in Windermere because it was the Lake District. But it did let slip when I said I was visiting Treblinka, that I'd be stopping off at Warsaw. And he said, well, he lived on Stawki in an apartment with his family. And as it emerged that Stawki, his apartment, looked down on the Umschlagplatz, the departure point for the railway departure point for the Warsaw Ghetto going to Treblinka. So I just felt, he wouldn't possibly go to Treblinka. But I thought, well, I knew a friend, Miroslav Balka, who was a very well-known international contemporary artist. And Miroslav's town called Otwoch, which is just outside Warsaw, he was 12, we're the same age. And his small town, until he was 12, he didn't know. Nobody talked about the fact that half the town, which was a Jewish community, and they'd been deported to Treblinka. So I said to Miroslav, he'd done a lot of work about this. And I said, would you take us to Treblinka? And he said he would, in the car. And it helped being, he lives in Warsaw, but we went on a journey with my colleague, Rose Smith, went with us, and we fetched up in Treblinka. There's too many stories to tell, but he took us to the local railway station, Malkinia, which is the big railway junction there. He took us into the small waiting room, which was like a throwback to Soviet times. Old people crouched over on, sort of formica tables. And it got a sense of its otherness. It's not like Auschwitz. It's the numbers of visitors at Auschwitz are just incredible, even compared to when I first went many years ago. But Treblinka was very remote. It felt as though you're going back into this old Poland, this old East. And we had a couple of shocks there. But then he took us into the camp itself. We parked in the car park outside, and we walked into Treblinka, and he was a terrific guide. But it was, as Caroline said, it was a forest. You walked through a forest opening, and suddenly it opened up into this huge memorial. There were similarities. I've been to Kelmno, which was in a forest clearing, another awful place. And it was just deeply affecting compared to Auschwitz, because when we were there was absolutely nobody around. There were no visitors whatsoever. The three of us wandered around this place, and it was very, very different from Auschwitz, from the numbers, the trade. But we saw in the car park outside, we just managed to catch in time. There's a small visitor centre. And in this small visitor centre was an exhibition and some work about this British, what leapt out was a British archaeologist. Name was Professor, Caroline. And I thought, that's really peculiar because it seems so remote in Poland. It was so, you know, Treblinka was established halfway between Warsaw and Białystok, you know, ghettos, and it just seemed, and I just saw Caroline's name and I thought, and Miroslav knew of her work as well. So I thought, let's contact her and see if we just, I was just curious about how she'd fetched up there. But we discovered, I think it was important for me, we wanted to do some archaeology at Calgarth because it had disappeared. The estate where the boys had stayed, it had been totally eradicated, the green fields. But I also, because by then we've really gone into a lot of work about the boys, the survivors. And Caroline, it just seemed right and appropriate that she'd been so immersed in Treblinka, in studying Treblinka. And we knew a number of our survivors had lost their families there, including Sam. That's where Sam's family went. So I felt I was doing it as sort of a duty for him and visiting some of the places where they can't possibly visit. They couldn't, but I was sort of detached enough to go. So I invited Karen if she would come and do some excavations of the hostels where some of the boys are staying. And then we were very lucky to have a visit while she was there in 2019 from Sam Laskia and Ike Alterman. Both of them, coincidentally not, had lost their families at Treblinka. And there they were at Calgarth with excavations going on, uncovering their lives there. But also we knew that we were sort of somehow paying homage to their families as well. The 300 youngsters that came to Windermere, they were representative of their communities and their families. And I always think it's really important they carry with them their families. They are of their families. And their families, unfortunately, for the 300 that came here, they died in places, they were murdered in places like Treblinka and Auschwitz and Chelmno. You know, I sort of make a point of not visiting sites that don't have a relevance to our story in Windermere. It's very easy to get caught up in visiting horror sites of this, but the only sites I'll visit is if there is a personal connection to one of the children that we knew. And so you feel as though there's a reason to be there. And there is a sense that you're visiting on their behalf and paying respects on their behalf. And it gives you an understanding, I'll just end at this, an understanding of what it meant for them to be in Windermere. And I think to fully grasp the impact of the Lake District, of the Windermere children, you have to really, really consider where they come from and what they'd emerged from. And the striking thing is many of them couldn't talk about that. There's an absence, just as though there is an absence on the surface at Treblinka, there's an absence on the surface at Calgarth. But Caroline, through her team, can dig deeper into the significance of these places. And you create a link, an incredible link between Britain and Troutbeck Bridge, Windermere, Lake District, and this infamous place of Treblinka. But you can somehow turn it into a positive because these guys did survive, but they carried with them, even in Windermere, a sense of melancholy. Yes, it was fantastic, but they'd left their families behind. And I approached Karen, and I didn't think really we'd do the work that we've done together. But they're an incredible team. And to see her sitting down with Sam and Ike in the summer of 2019, listening to their stories, it was incredibly profound, knowing the work that she'd done over there, where their families, sadly, where they'd been, yes, they said where they were murdered. And I think it had a huge impact on both Sam and Ike. So is that helpful? I mean, that's
Trevor, that builds things up amazingly. Maybe it's now time to turn to Caroline and Trevor. I'll keep you on screen in case you've got anything to chip in along the way. But maybe one should say, sort of in the introduction to why Caroline is doing the work in Windermere. I mean, we talked about, the obliteration at Treblinka, or the re-understanding of it now, given more information. But you think about this country and you think, well, why are you having to forensically investigate a site like that? And one thing that we should say, if people don't know it, is that the building of the seaplane factory on the shores of Windermere and the building of that housing estate for the workers there was only on condition of the Friends of the Lake District, who insisted that after its use had finished, that it was completely returned to nature. And am I right in saying that they did such a good job of cleaning the site that it's almost, well, it's easy for people to say it never existed?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's that. I think that's one of the key kind of parallels with Windermere and from a landscape point of view, and many Holocaust sites, is that absence in the landscape allows people either to deny or to forget, what was happening. And as Trevor mentioned, when he discovered the story, similarly, when I discovered the story, it wasn't something that we were taught at school, yet it's such a fundamental part of British history and our shared history all around the world of what happened to the Windermere children. So it really struck me that we needed to use those same methods that we'd used in Treblinka to try and rediscover these buildings. And of course, we got a lot of questions like, why do you need to do that? Why do we need to find these buildings? What's archaeology going to tell us? And I think some of it was that kind of symbolic sort of uncovering, and therefore you're at the same time uncovering the memory and the story of the site. But also, as I've said before, obviously archaeology can tell us things that perhaps the history books can't, and sort of understanding a little bit more about the way that the children lived at Windermere and what they experienced, I think was incredibly important. And we also did it in 2019 as a community archaeology project. So we had Sam and Ike, but we had second, third, and even fourth generation survivors with us, and then people from all sorts of walks of life that probably never even heard of this story before. But perhaps archaeology was the draw, or perhaps the fact that this story was so unusual was the draw. People had different reasons for coming, but we had an amazing group of people who came, and it was a really phenomenal kind of use of archaeology as kind of building community and building these stories. So yeah, but the demolition was pretty complete, and that was one of the things we weren't sure about. We knew from people obviously talking to Trevor and from photographs and things, we knew that they'd used big machines to kind of bulldoze the buildings and to level the site, but we didn't know to what extent that destruction had been complete. And just like at Treblinka, where we hear the campus demolished, we hear the campus destroyed, what those words mean different things to different people. So part of the archaeology was trying to find out, had they really destroyed everything? Had everything really gone? Or were there traces there to find? And although in some cases, particularly with the hostels, we're talking about fragmented bricks, we're talking about pieces of asbestos from the roof, we're talking about the pipes, the pipe works, the water pipes, the sewage pipes, those kind of things that connected the building. And so sometimes they're fairly abstract, but they are traces of those buildings. And we do have some maps and sketches of Calgarth, but not architecturally accurate necessarily. So one of the things with even finding the sort of remnants of destruction, we've been able to kind of build a more detailed map of the Calgarth estate as well.
So what does it tell us about this history? That I mean, the boys, or the boys and girls, but the boys who were there went on after a few months and to rebuild their lives, having been rehabilitated, which was a thing in itself, which was groundbreaking work in itself, and wanted to get on with their lives. And in those years, like Sam never talked about the things before Windermere. People didn't talk about it, and also there was probably not an appetite to hear about it. So what do we know now that has been lost because it wasn't spoken about and because it's been eradicated and bulldozed? What is it telling us about that part of post-war history that is going to make our understanding richer?
Well, I think. Oh, sorry, Trevor, go on.
Yeah, so, I was recently speaking to Angela Cohen, who's Rob Rinder's mum, but chair of 45A Society. And we were chatting about this. What it is, I think, what Calgarth and the Windermere story afforded many of the survivors, the boys and girls, is to talk, is a focus and gave them something that they could. It was a vehicle for them to talk about their experiences from that time. And I think that's often one of the most valuable, many valuable things of it. But she said you gave them that license to talk about it. Now, even to talk about, they talked about it with each other, even that moment of arrival in the Lake District. We always have to remember Maya Hirsch, another of the Manchester boys, he said to me, although we were liberated in Theresienstadt, we weren't free until we came to Windermere, to the Lake District. But they were still carrying with them a lot of obvious demons while they were in Windermere. Some, for instance, a fifth of them were physically very, very unwell. They're supposed to be very fit and healthy. There were the traumas around. And it's interesting when you hear if you look at some of the source material, they will say we didn't have to talk about it because we all knew what we'd lived through. That's what they'll say now. If you go back to the source material, they were cared for largely by psychoanalysts, and they were encouraged to talk about it, and they talked about it a lot, their recent experience. They particularly seem to have talked about the death marches and the hunger. They didn't talk very much about the camps. In their recent history, that was their recent experience with the death marches. And over time, they'd sort of seen that as that's what they believed. But when coming back to Windermere, we've allowed them to go all the way to that time to wait a minute. Oh, it was wonderful. We did this, we did that, and we did talk. And it's a really interesting process. Memory and history are fascinating things. Absolutely fascinating. Certainly, the important thing, Calgarth is on the site of a school, or the school is on the Lake School is on the site of Calgarth. And the important part, it brings history to life for children. I've seen many pupils joining Caroline the guys this week, learning about where they are, what their school stands on. But the interesting part, a few years ago, I met a history teacher who'd worked at the Lake School for 19 years, from the beginning to the end. And they came and they said, all the time I've worked here, I knew nothing about Calgarth. I knew nothing about these children. I knew nothing. So how quickly history can be lost when there's an intent to eradicate it. So there is a similarity with Calgarth and with Treblinka. They're very, very different locations, but the historical processes of memory, loss of memory and significance there are parallels. Sorry, Caroline. Yeah, you can.
No, I was just putting that up to illustrate what you were saying, really, just to kind of show. So actually, you can see that the Lake School there in the middle, and all the football pitches, netball courts, and leisure centres, and all these things that have been built on the area that was the Calgarth estate, and in the sort of the I suppose it's like a darker brown colour. You can see the hostel buildings that the children were living in. Some of them anyway. I mean, there were many more than this, but these were the ones that we worked on in 2019, for example, and we were able to locate where they would have been situated from overlaying maps and aerial photographs, and then from doing our geophysical work. So we didn't find sort of in situ foundations as such, but we did find kind of as I mentioned, the sewage pipes, the water pipes connecting where the buildings would have been, and then the spread of rubble. So we could kind of situate these buildings in this landscape. And I'll just flip back a couple of slides. This is what Calgarth looked like, in 1941. So you can see there were huge amounts of buildings across this site, all of which have been subsequently flattened. So the archaeology has enabled us to, as I said, sort of relocate the positions of some of those buildings. And I think for me, one of the most powerful things about the project, and I think this is always one of the most powerful things about any project that I work on, is when you bring survivors to the site and you share with them those archaeological findings and you explain to them what you're searching for, and then to hear their recollections when you start to speak about those places. So, you know, in bringing Sam and Ike to the site, you know, we were able to obviously hear their stories, which really kind of brought those bricks and, you know, those bits of bricks and asbestos and all these things we were digging out of the ground. It really brought them to life, but it also had them tell us things that perhaps they hadn't mentioned. And I remember Ike, we were walking down the road, and he just kept saying to Trevor, "What are you talking about, these hostels? What are you talking about? We lived in chalets." And I think for years he'd always kind of not really know what you're talking about when you said you wanted to find the hostels, and then coming to the site, you know, he'd kind of gone, "Oh, okay, now, you know, now I kind of understand it. Yeah, that was, you know, that was over there. Is that what you're finding?" And suddenly for him, you know, the kind of landscape of Calgarth kind of clicked into place. And for us, we got to hear his experiences and stories of those places to share with our students as well, who were there, and members of the community, and obviously subsequently via the website that Trevor manages, and through other outlets. So I think, you know, it's also about kind of bringing the landscape to life when there's nothing there to see, and finding those places that the children sat and had those, you know, difficult conversations about how to rebuild their lives, and, you know, where they learned. So this week, for example, we've been searching for the remains of the assembly hall and the school that were present on the site, where they learn English, you know, and they learn how to sort of think about things like careers and all of those things. So finding those buildings are really important, so that we can hopefully then situate some information in that landscape, so that when visitors come to the site, they can obviously understand a little bit more about just how important these places were in rebuilding the lives of the children after what they've been through elsewhere.
Caroline, do you have any photographs of some of the findings from?
Yes, I do. Yeah, so this is some of us sort of working away again with various contraptions. But if I move through some of these, so these are some of the in the areas of some of the buildings, for example, the various demolition rubble and material that were present. But then we did have some objects, you know, mixed in with the demolition rubble of Calgarth. Now, of course, some of them, it's difficult to date some of them, because Calgarth was used obviously during the war, and obviously the site's been demolished and moved around. But we've done various bits of research on the ones that we can sort of say are contemporary. So we've got a penknife that was actually found by the son-in-law of one of the Windermere girls who was at the site. Actually, he was excavating with us, and very proudly found the small penknife there. We've got a key and a comb. We also had some curly top hair cream for children that we found in the site, and I think the one that we caused probably the most debate amongst all of us was this small, I decided it was a unicorn. Some people say it's a horse, but this small, obviously small child's toy that we found in the top right-hand corner there, that we've dated to the 1940s. You know, so we don't know for sure, but we sort of think that it could be contemporary to when the children were there. And then many of the other finds, of course, as I said, were objects more connected to the actual structures themselves, bricks and the like. But there are quite a number of these, and I'm sitting here. You can't of course see where I'm sitting, but I'm sitting here in Windermere Library. Trevor's now made an exhibition of some of the objects, photographs of them, but also the original objects and bricks and other material that we did find. So if you do any of the audience find themselves in Windermere, then obviously I'd strongly encourage you to come and see some of the objects in person if you can.
Thanks, Caroline. You know, we're coming up to, it's 9:25, and we said that we would run up to past if we needed to. I think I just want to thank both of you so much for coming on tonight, and especially you, Caroline, for giving us the insights into a very, very, you know, heavy topic really, but explaining it so well, and you know, just giving us some clear insights into the history that we need to carry forward, and seeing how that's relevant even in our own country, and how all this work goes forward to make sure that we learn the lessons from then for how we work in the future, and how we actually make sure that people just don't deny the horrors that happened, or even some of the you know, like in Windermere. I mean, Windermere wasn't a horror, but people want to obscure that as a way of obscuring the horrors that happened under the Nazis. That's terrible. I want to just take the last few minutes for any questions. I mean, we had a few on Treblinka, and I know, I'm sorry if we've not answered your questions. We will send out the links to that Caroline is going to send us to her works on Treblinka, but also to the links to the Lake District Holocaust Project, which Trevor Avery runs in Windermere. And of course, you'll know the TV programme, The Windermere Boys, that the BBC produced recently, which is the one that Sam Lasker got so excited. Sam is no longer with us, very sadly, during COVID, and but Ike is actually going to be presenting at Yom HaShoah at the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester this Wednesday. So Ike is so full of life and so amazing. It's great to see her. But if anybody's got a question about Windermere, please do put it in the chat, or if you put up your hand, maybe if it's a quick question, we can actually let you ask yourself. While people are thinking about that, Caroline, how long do you think you're going to be, how much more work is there to do in Windermere?
Well, I think as long as Trevor will have us, is the easy answer to that. But no, we've made great progress just in this week. You know, we've been working in new areas where we, you know, we're seeing greater preservation of some of the structures. Even just from an initial glance of some of the data we've collected, we can see that some of the structures are, you know, much more intact than in other areas. But it's a big site. There's a lot of ground to cover, and so I think, you know, we would like to think that certainly for the next few years that we'd be coming back, and obviously once we've all the material we've uncovered, it's just as Lake District Holocaust Project does, we also have a commitment to education and to making sure that you know, the wider public knows about the work that we do. So we're going to be involved in you know, various public lectures, talks, museum exhibitions, and various collaborative ventures with Trevor moving forward as well. So I think hopefully there's still a lot to learn, and sadly, of course, you know, as we've mentioned already, that so many survivors are passing on, and I think we've obviously got to find new ways to share their stories and share the horrors of the Holocaust with the next generations as well. So hopefully the work that we're doing here, particularly in a British context, you know, it can hopefully make people see that this isn't something that happened really far away and has no connection to us. And so that's why I think the Windermere story is so powerful, because not only is it one of hope, but it's also one that shows how, as you said right back at the beginning, Ed, that we're all connected to this story. It's all part of our collective history, and we've got a responsibility to remember that, and also, as we see in contemporary society, many of the same mistakes are being repeated, to try and gain, you know, use these new understandings we've got from archaeology and from history to try and tackle some of those contemporary issues as well. And
we've got a question of Craig. So Craig, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, Caroline. Thank you so much for this evening. I was just one question in particular around when you showed the slides to the old gas chamber. Did you manage to uncover like the more modern gas chamber or any other of the buildings?
Yeah, so that's been a kind of a bit of a conundrum for us that's ongoing, really. So we had a second area back in 2010 in the geophysical survey results that was much larger area, about 44 meters by 20 meters, that looked like a combination of structured remains but also building rubble. And so when we did the excavations in 2017, we redid some more of that survey, and then we did some small test pit excavations, and the demolition there seems to be much more comprehensive than it was with the older gas chamber building. So the newer gas chamber building, it was bigger. Obviously, it was where more of the mass murders were carried out, and it certainly seems to have you know, attracted greater attention from the Nazis in terms of their efforts to destroy it. So we were able to find what we believe to be some of the post holes which would have held up the foundations of the building. So there would have been sort of wooden posts, because it's sandy geology, to keep the foundation stable. So we found those, but we found very little in the way of finds, even building remnants above that, and certainly no in situ foundations in the areas that we excavated. So we didn't dig the whole thing, so that's something we, we'll probably go back to in future years, but it does certainly look like the efforts to hide the traces of those bigger gas chambers were more comprehensive.
Thank you, Craig. Nobody else has put their hands up, and I can't see any further questions in the chat. So I just want to be left to say thank you so much to Caroline, to Trevor, to Susan from AJR, and to NHEG as well for supporting this event, and for all of you for coming tonight and playing your part in this small way in the week commemorating Yom HaShoah.